title for tonight's conversation is Confronting the Challenges Facing the West. And I have to say that in the prep call with our two ambassadors a couple weeks ago, I thought for sure that this might be kind of a modest, kind of a, dare I say, milquetoast conversation about what's going on in the world and maybe just kind of a light discussion about U.S.-Swiss relations. Within about 3 minutes, it was clear that this was going to be a rather charged and direct conversation. And so I'm just so grateful for both of our ambassadors joining us. I am Dean of the School of Public Policy. You see some of our brochures here. We offer a 2-year Master in Public Policy degree. And as you see in the brochure, we are committed to the American conversation. And I think it's worth noting that that is important in 2 ways. One, it is a conversation. We are about preparing leaders to think critically about the problems facing our communities, nation, and world. And in a space, academia, that in some ways has given up on conversation, I think it's important that institutions like Pepperdine remain committed to it. The only way that we're going to find our way through this era that we find ourselves in, both in the United States and I would argue in the West, is if we're able to talk to one another in deliberate and deliberative conversation. And that requires a certain perspective on how we view the other. And at Pepperdine, I can say that it is important for us to understand that even with our differences, we believe that we are all created by God for certain purposes and missions, and that when we come together to discuss and deliberate over the world's challenges, it's done with a spirit that is focused on the common good. And this tonight is certainly going to be an example of this common good approach. You know our 2 guests here, but I will introduce them anyway. Ambassador Jacques Pitteloud is the Swiss ambassador to the United States. He joined the Swiss Foreign Service in 1987 after earning his PhD at the University of Zurich. From 1991 to 95, he served as the Swiss in Swiss Strategic Intelligence and has served a number of ambassadorships. And can we say, Ambassador, what your next tour of duty is going to be? He will wrap up his time in Washington, D.C. later this summer and will be the next Swiss ambassador to NATO, operating in Brussels beginning this fall. Robert O'Brien is a distinguished senior fellow at the School of Public Policy. He is also currently the co-founder and chairman of American Global Strategies, a DC-based strategic advisory firm. He was the United States National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021, and before that, a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. He has service in the State Department and the United Nations on the United Nations Security Council as their senior counsel. And please join me in welcoming both of our ambassadors this evening. So the outline for this discussion is I'm going to engage both of our ambassadors in some questions and dialogue for the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, and then we are going to open it up for questions from you all. And so we certainly do welcome those questions in our last 15 or so minutes together. If you saw the invitation online, you saw that we are going to look to address 3 major challenges facing the West. One is in the area of the academy and our colleges and universities, education more broadly. Second is in the area of technology. What are those challenges that we're seeing, both from social media to AI? And third, we will be looking at the major challenges in geopolitics. So let's begin with the academy. Obviously, we are here at an academic institution. Ambassador Pitteloud, I'll begin with you first. It is fair to say that American higher education is in a period of some polarization and upheaval. We have seen examples of a number of protests on college campuses throughout the country related to the Hamas-Israel war and conflict. We've seen commencement exercises canceled. And that is important for this discussion because the debate is really around a foreign policy matter. I've been reading recently that we've seen some of these protests come over to Switzerland, where there have been protests at Zurich University, University of Geneva, and others. Talk a little bit about what you're perceiving. You're right there in Washington, D.C. I'll just say, and I'll say it publicly, I'm embarrassed to be an undergraduate, an alumnus of George Washington University. To see what's happening on that campus is both shocking and deeply disappointing, but we're seeing that on other college campuses in DC. Talk a little bit about what you're perceiving in the United States, and as we talk about challenges facing the West, how do you see the role of academia as it relates to confronting those challenges?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. But after 5 years of observing what's happening in American academia and also going on the ground because I've been teaching in various American universities, I realized I had underestimated, and you will pardon my French, the state of decay of intellectual freedom at American universities, and especially in the top ones. I think that the majority of Americans have been watching kind of helplessly, or maybe they were just looking elsewhere, and what was happening in their faculties and how their faculties were turning into ideological factories where intellectual debate is being shunned. Intellectual debate is less and less possible, and personally I was struck by how scared the students were to have an opinion. Because nowadays, to have an opinion at university, if it's not the one that fits the ideological framework that has been given, can endanger your career, or could endanger your career, because the events of the last 6 months have definitely changed something and exposed the dark underbelly of American academia. I was flabbergasted to see how students who would even be on the far left but didn't fit the ideological framework because they were real Marxists, the one that you normally find only in museums, they were the real ones, they would be cancelled and excluded from the debate, like if they would have been pro-life conservatives. And this is really bad, because university is the very place where you should have outrageous ideas, you should be able to debate anything, you should be free to develop your intellectual freedom. And so right now I think that if there is anything positive about the events of the last few months, it is that it has exposed something that needs to be corrected in American academia.
Robert, let's focus on the United States. One of the burgeoning stories that we've seen over the last 6 months has been, even within the State Department, there has been a lot of conflict related to the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel. And at least some of the connections that I have there, or at least in that sphere, have noted that some of these people that are in some ways critiquing America's policy, or the stated policy of President Biden, wanting to get more aggressive with Israel, that much of this is actually coming out of academia, that these are people coming into the State Department, into the Foreign Service, from very highly respected colleges and universities, but particularly over the last decade, the people that have been coming out of these schools of foreign service or international studies departments have become more ideological. Talk a little bit about, if you will, about academia's role in preparing that next generation of foreign policy scholars and leaders, and what concerns you might have about the current state of academia.
Oh, thank you, Pete, and thank you for having me. And Lomri and I feel like it's a little bit of a homecoming. We lived here for 2 years back in the 90s. I said our friends, the co-chairs, are here, and thank you for coming out tonight. But we love this part of Switzerland, and what Pepperdine is doing is just amazing. So thank you for what you're doing for academia, and to have so many students here from Pepperdine and get to talk to them is really a treat for us. And the same problems we're seeing at places like Columbia are not happening at Pepperdine. I can tell you that. So I just went to Columbia 2 weeks ago. Lomri went with my wife went with me, and we went to talk about hostage diplomacy. I was with Hillary Clinton and our current hostage envoy Roger Carstens, and we wanted to talk about how countries around the world are taking American hostages, students, diplomats, business people, athletes, taking them hostage and attempting to use them to leverage American foreign policy. And not at our seminar, but at a previous seminar, Hillary had been run off campus. This is Secretary Clinton, not politically aligned with me at all, very liberal, but she was seen as too pro-Israel for the students, and they actually ran her off campus. So we didn't have that experience, but what we did do is we met with the Jewish students afterwards. And what was shocking is that Jewish students were telling us they couldn't wear a yarmulke, they couldn't wear their Star of David necklace, they couldn't wear anything that signified that they were Jewish, or they wouldn't be allowed on campus. That these thugs, these Antifa, I don't even think they're pro-Palestinian, although pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist demonstrators were keeping the Jews off campus. Now, it's one thing to be anti-Israel, and you can disagree with the Netanyahu government or disagree with Israeli policy, but when you take it to the next level and say, if you're a Jew, you can't come on campus, there's something very dangerous and very dark about that happening in America. And we're seeing it in London, we're seeing it in Sydney, and other places around the world. So just a quick experience I had, this was off campus, but also in New York. Dr. Kissinger became a mentor of mine, and when I was National Security Advisor, I used to call Henry about every 2 weeks and get advice from him and talk to him about negotiations, arms control, whatever we were dealing with. And Henry died recently, and he had a memorial service, and the family was kind enough to invite me. And as I left the memorial service, there were protesters there, of course. 2 of them detached themselves from the protest and followed me. Fortunately, I had a Secret Service officer with me, and they were yelling, "Killer, die! You're a war criminal. You're going to die. You should die." And I thought, gosh, I was in the Trump administration, so I'm used to some pretty tough language. But no one said anything about being National Security Advisor. No one said anything about al-Baghdadi or Soleimani, some of the events we were involved with. I thought, why are these guys hating so badly and wanted me to die? And so I got in the car, and I kind of ran my hand through my hair, and I felt that I had my yarmulke on that I'd been wearing at the service out of respect for Dr. Kissinger. And I thought they were coming after me because they thought I was a Jew. And that's what our Jewish brothers and sisters are dealing with, not just on campus, but out in the big cities in America. And this vile anti-Semitism is something we've got to be very concerned about. But it's an outgrowth of what Jacques Pitteloud talked about, the shutting down of ideas and the shutting down of debate and making the other the enemy because of who they are. And that's happened too often on academic campuses and at our best universities. And if it doesn't end, it's going to end very poorly for America. Our experiment is as a democracy, when we start vilifying people because of their race or their class or that sort of thing, that's very un-American, and that'll be the end of our experiment. I hope we get it under control.
Jacques, you had mentioned, you put your finger, obviously there are several different dimensions here. One is the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on a number of college campuses, but you also noted specifically this quality of critical thinking, this inability to express oneself, this challenge that students believe they will face if they express an unpopular opinion. For the students who are here, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance, given the work that you do in diplomacy, given the work that you've done and continue to do around national intelligence and national security, the importance of having a curious perspective, the importance of working with and being around people that are willing to ask inconvenient questions. Obviously, in the end, a decision has to be made in whatever the foreign policy or national security issue is. But I wondered if you could speak directly to the importance of critical thinking in the work that you do?
How much time do you have? No, because in my career, I was lucky or unlucky enough to be the witness to the last genocide of the 20th century, to a civil war in the Balkans, to a civil war in Southeast Asia, and quite a few, and now the Russian aggression against the Ukraine, and I could go on with the list. And every time the conclusion is the same: choose your date, and you are right. Because history is a very complex factor, and whenever, let's talk about the Balkans, you choose the date of the Battle of Kosovo-Polje, and Kosovo is yours or it's the Serbians. It's always just choosing your date wisely, make sure. So it means for the students, study history. History is infinitely complex. And now we see in the Middle East and in the Near East, in the conflict about Israel, people speaking about the Nakba in 1948 and speaking about the settlements and not understanding actually on both sides, but especially on the side now of the pro-Palestinian extremist movements at university, they don't understand the story of the Near East. They have not studied it. For them, it's about propaganda. There is no critical thinking. There is no confrontation with facts that would go against their ideology. And I'm not taking side, because this being an incredibly complex conflict, there will have to be concessions on both sides. Let me tell you something. One year ago, a little bit, one summer ago, I had at my home Palestinian and Israeli activists, peace activists, young people, the age of the students here, who had been working very hard on trying to establish a dialogue and whatever. 1 year later, 2 of my guests are dead. One was a young Israeli activist. She was 22. She was abducted, raped, tortured, and killed on October 7th. And one of the Palestinian activists was killed by a bombing 2 months later. This is the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is this is a very complex conflict. So the first thing is to study history, to understand why and what are the reasons and what are the stories of settlements. Otherwise, you just choose your date. And my date in the Middle East would be, why don't we give it back to Italy, because it was part of the Roman Empire. In the end, you can always choose a date.
Robert, talk a little bit about the politicization of foreign policy. I think one of the things that has just been remarkable to witness in the United States over the last few months is a foreign policy issue in which the United States is not directly engaged. I've heard a number of commentators try to equate what's going on America's college campuses today with the 1960s, and I have to say, I think that is one of the worst historical analogies. I mean, to equate an era in which in the 60s, Americans were dying by the tens of thousands where we were directly engaged and involved, to a period in which there are no American boots on the ground. We have very little leverage with what is the policies that are being decided upon there, yet we are seeing very similar levels of vitriol, and it is appearing to play a role in this year's presidential election. At least it appears that in one side, President Biden is trying to hold the line, I believe he is, on supporting Netanyahu, but at the same time, recent decisions in pulling back arms shipments seem to indicate that he is listening to certain parts of his party. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing in this politicization of a foreign policy issue in which the United States really isn't even directly involved.
Yeah, so we've always had politics involved in foreign policy in America. Surprise, surprise. And what I probably should do is hand the mic to John Ricolta, Ambassador Ricolta. Raise your hand, John. John was one of our great ambassadors. He was the U.S. ambassador to the UAE, the Emirates, when we got the Abraham Accords done. And I was involved in negotiating those accords, and John did a great job for us on the ground in the UAE. But he's also from Detroit, and we were talking about this yesterday with the large number of Arab immigrants that we have in Detroit and in Michigan in general. And Michigan is probably the swingiest of the swing states. There's 10,000 votes in Michigan will probably decide who the next president of the United States is. And so those Arab votes, 100,000 Arabs voted in the Democrat primary. and they voted uncommitted. They didn't vote for Joe Biden. And so if they don't vote for him in the general election, President Trump is guaranteed to be elected. So that group of voters is very important. And they're very obviously concerned about what's happening in Israel, what's happening in the Middle East generally, but especially in Gaza. And so that's driving American policy in a way that is somewhat surprising, because the Jewish voters have been such a key constituency of the Democrat Party as well. Mm-hmm. But Biden is taking a stand on behalf of Arabs that we've never seen before, and Palestinians that we've never seen before. And a lot of people would say, I think I'd be in this club, would say we're really betraying Israel with the arms embargo. But again, we shouldn't. I don't think we should look at this in a vacuum, because look, I'm Irish American, and Irish Americans, and especially in Massachusetts, supported the IRA. A lot of Irish Americans did during the Troubles in the UK. Put a lot of pressure on, senators like with the name of Kennedy. Over the years, put a lot of pressure on the Brits. South Africa was a big issue with African Americans, especially, but a lot of especially students with apartheid. So we've seen this sort of activism happen in the past. What we haven't seen is this kind of activism on behalf of a group, Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that's as bad as any terrorist organization we've ever seen. I mean, these guys are as brutal and as cruel, and I don't even call them terrorists, I call them serial killers. I mean, what they did on October 7th is beyond the realm of anything that you can imagine. It was not a military operation. It was a killing spree. And the fact that you have protesters on college campuses who aren't pro-Palestinian but are holding up signs saying they're pro-Hamas, that's really shocking. That we're seeing that kind of sympathy with Hamas. And we all feel for the Palestinian people, the innocent Palestinian people that are harmed in Gaza. But what's interesting with Hamas is armies are developed to defend civilian populations. Throughout history, the army is there. If you're a people, the army is to protect you, the civilians, against the enemy. This is the first time we've had an army, Hamas, using civilians to protect themselves against the Israelis. So every death that takes place in Gaza is lamentable, both the friendly fire for the Israelis that happened today, the Israelis are being killed, but also the Palestinian civilians, the innocent civilians. But these deaths are at the feet of Hamas. This is not Israel's doing, this is Hamas's doing. And the fact that we have so many students that have gotten confused because, as Jacques said, they don't have either they don't have the critical thinking capability, or they don't understand the history of the Middle East and don't understand what's happened. Either one of them is a bad outcome, right? You're either stupid or you're ill-informed. I mean, neither one of those things is a good outcome for our students at our best universities.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Jacques? So I did want to ask you one last question, because obviously one of the things that we're beginning to see are some of these protests coming onto campus in Switzerland, in Swiss universities. Do you have a broader concern of not just the protests, because obviously students have protested on university campuses for millennia, but this particular kind of protest, which does have this anti-Semitic, in some ways, I would argue, in its ideological format, anti-Western view. To what degree are you concerned with this coming over into Europe?
When I was at the University of Zurich in the 80s, and there was the military coup against the freedom fighters in Poland, the Marxist groups organized at university a protest against the CIA-led coup in Poland by General Jaruzelski. So we had our guys too, and we had violent protests. Actually, it was much more violent in the 80s. I think these guys are a little bit lame compared to what we used to be, because we used to have violent fights at university. So that's nothing new. What is certain is that everything American at some point contaminates positively or negatively Europe, because the US is the dominant cultural power, whether we like it or not. And so wokeism, in its most extreme forms, is of course now infecting our universities too, and I think it is a duty of anyone from the generation who could still think and still have a critical thinking to stop them before they infect the intellectual world here. Because it's really, really scary to see what it did to American critical thinking. And we can't allow it to happen to our universities. It's happening already. It's happening already. But for those, and I know we have some representatives of Swiss universities here who maybe haven't been in the US the last few years, come with me and I'll show you what should not happen and why we should not allow it to happen. We should have debate, we should have freedom, we should have freedom of expression, and we should not allow this type of intellectual fascism, because that's what it is, to contaminate our universities. That's definitely something we need to fight now, and not wait until we reach American, let's say, an American situation before we start correcting.
So let's move to the second topic that we wanted to discuss, which is the role of technology and the challenges that it is playing in world affairs. Robert, we can take this in a number of different directions. Obviously, you've been very vocal in your critique of TikTok as one platform, and obviously its deep connections to China and its ability to both take data from the United States and from Americans, but also to promote particular messages, which in some ways are aligned with some of the protest movements that we're seeing. But why don't we start with TikTok and social media more broadly? What are the challenges that you're seeing there?
Thanks. I just want to say before I address that question, we're going to miss Jacques Pitteloud. He's a great ambassador to the United States of America. Thank you, Switzerland, for sending him. Yeah. He was a terrific partner for me when I was trying to get hostages out of places like Iran and around the world. Jacques was always there and was a great partner. And Ed McMullen, our former ambassador, American ambassador to Switzerland, was one of our best. And he and Jacques and I conspired and worked to get people home from Iran, and we got a number of people home from Iran and other parts of the world. And we're going to miss you, Jacques. It's NATO's gain. You're a great military officer, so you're going to the right place. But we're going to miss you in Washington. And you got a little flavor for the influence that Jacques has and the common sense thinking that he's brought to the United States as your representative. So you can be proud of him. So the issue about TikTok and social media, I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. I was in Taiwan 2 years ago, and I sat down with the Taiwanese digital minister. They have a minister for digital affairs. They're so worried about disinformation and misinformation and deep fakes and that sort of thing that they've created a cabinet level official to handle those issues. And I said, what do you think about TikTok, Madam Tang? And she said, the espionage part of it or the propaganda part of it? It's the most impressive espionage tool that's ever been developed. We had a spy balloon that came across America. Some of you, did you guys see the news about the spy balloon? The Chinese sent a spy balloon across the entire U.S. Terrible. We should have shot it down immediately. We didn't. It collected intelligence on us for weeks. TikTok is like having 150 million spy balloons, sensors in our country all over the place all at once. Every phone that's got TikTok on it, TikTok collects every bit of data off that phone. Your passwords, your text, your bank account information, your medical information, your contacts, your social network, all that gets hoovered up into the cloud. And there was a time when that wouldn't have mattered, right? Because there was so much information that it was useless. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they opened up the Stasi warehouses. Remember the East German intelligence service? And they opened those warehouses, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of data that had been collected on the citizens of East Germany. But it was useless because there was no one to go through it. But with machine learning and algorithms and big data now, that data can be accessed, crunched, and to come up with macro trends about a country, but also it can focus in on you. So if you're one of the people that the Chinese are interested in, I know all my data is with the Chinese, so there's no secrets there. But they can know everything about you. So think if you're a military officer, an American pilot, they know where you are. If you have TikTok on your phone and there's a war in the Taiwan Straits, they know where you are. They don't have to shoot down a $150 million F-22 that they don't have the capability to maybe take down. They just have to send a sniper out to shoot the pilot to make sure he or she doesn't get to the plane. That TikTok is like a geolocator device on them. On the propaganda front, TikTok is used to divide. The algorithms are different in TikTok here in America or here in Europe than it is in China. The algorithms are meant to divide society. And so two friends of mine who were working for a major tech entrepreneur wanted to find out for themselves what TikTok did. So they got 2 clean iPhones, and they did an experiment. This was last month. They put in the iPhone 18-year-old male interested in motor cars. And they did one for Instagram and one for TikTok. Instagram, the ads, there were posts about car hot rods, posts about auto mechanics, advertisements for auto parts that came up with that sort of thing. On TikTok, it was auto parts, automobiles, hot rods, trans. Automobiles, trans, Hamas, automobiles. The algorithm was clearly being used to infiltrate the minds of an 18-year-old, and then the self-harm started in. Fentanyl, drugs, kill yourself, that sort of thing. From nothing in the profile other than an 18-year-old American male interested in automobiles. And so TikTok is an extraordinarily dangerous product. I give the Chinese credit for it, though. I mean, as someone involved in intelligence, and Jacques, you were involved in intelligence in a big way here in Switzerland. What a Trojan horse to put into our country, to divide us, to spy on us, and also to make money. It's paid for itself. And at some point, even when if this new law is upheld by the courts that just passed Congress, if TikTok is domesticated, so the Chinese have to sell TikTok to an American company, they'll make billions off it. So they'll have spied on us for years, divided us, and then they'll make 20, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars from it. It's quite ingenious, and it's very dastardly.
Jacques?
Yeah, before we go to the purely security policy dimension of the new technologies and especially of the social media, we have to speak about the societal damage that they have inflicted upon the whole generation. And it is really interesting to see that there is only one example in the history of humankind of such an acceleration of information circulation. It was the invention of the printing press in the late 15th century. And it took the states 2 centuries to master this new phenomenon, to understand how do you do, and back then it was to master the freedom ideas, to stop them from spreading. So it was more of a negative aspect. Now we are confronted with a situation that's the exact opposite. The voices of freedom, the voices of moderation, the voices of critical thinking, the voices of studying history before saying anything are being drowned. And they're being drowned on one hand by the omnipresence of the social media and the 144 characters. And it's really difficult to have an intelligent conversation in 144 characters. But on top of this, the groupthink inducing algorithms that have put people more and more into chapels where they only see and hear what they want to see and hear and what reinforces their own opinion. And so if there is a book that I would invite you to read, it's a book, it just came out, it's by Jonathan Haidt, it's called The Anxious Generation. Mm-hmm. And The Anxious Generation is describing the untold damage we have inflicted on Generation Z and on the millennials, and how our generation were totally overprotective with the kids in the sense of driving them everywhere, making sure they were never left alone. They would never play alone in the woods like we did. We protected them, and totally underprotective at home when we left them with these bloody machines, where kids. Toddlers have access to hard pornography, to all the things that they should not have access to. And it has created a generation that's totally anxious. And you look at the statistics, the psychiatric statistics in the US, The cases of anxiety have increased by more than 100% over the past 15 years. The case of self-mutilations, depression, the imposter syndrome, you name it, it's absolutely massive. And it hurts particularly young women. Young women have been disproportionately hurt by this phenomenon. So, and that's even before we start speaking about how these algorithms can be used by anti-freedom ideologies to destroy the very social fabric of our societies. But we actually don't need them. We are very busy doing it ourselves.
Robert, last time I was here was in the fall. We were hosting a 2-day conference through the policy school that was looking in part on cybersecurity and challenges here in Europe. I was reading the news that there had been a cyber attack on the Swiss Air Force by Russia back in January of this year. One of the points that Emily Goldman, cybersecurity expert, made in her talk, which she gave right here, that I'll never forget, is that people need to realize that in the various battlefields one might understand, that if you were looking at what she would describe as a kinetic warfare setting, you would obviously know that if a battle was waged and you had bullets flying and missiles and so forth, that there were troops amassed and drones overhead and so forth, that you would know that you're in a real war. And not only obviously would you know as a soldier and commander and political leaders, but your country would know. She said, what's so difficult about having the public understand what's happening in cybersecurity is we have actually been in a state of war with a number of countries for many years. And most people have no idea that we are at war every single day in cyberspace. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit as where we sit currently, but as we look into the future about whether it's, and the attacks all seem to be coming from the same characters. They all seem to be coming from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Talk a little bit about how the public, these students and the public here, should be thinking about cyberspace and cybersecurity.
Yeah, so everyone's been talking about cyber for years as the next big thing in warfare. And it's here, as you mentioned, as your expert talked about. My last trip to Europe in office, in fact, I was scheduled to come to Switzerland. I didn't come. I had to fly home and abbreviate the trip. I was in Paris. There was something called the Solar Winds attack, which you may recall, when the Russians got access through Microsoft to thousands and thousands of government agencies. Now, they didn't do anything malicious with it. We sent a very tough message to the Russians and said, if anyone dies or any infrastructure is compromised, there's going to be hell to pay. And they got that message. But think about it. If you get into an electrical grid and you shut it down, there are going to be deaths. Okay, so there may not be missiles flying, as you talked about. There may not be drones in the air. But there are going to be car accidents because the auto lights don't work. There are going to be people dying in hospitals because ventilators shut off. And backup systems didn't come on in time. There's going to be very serious damage. Water supply could be, and water purification could be damaged. So the threat from cyber attacks can actually have a kinetic result, even though you're just pushing buttons on a computer, and ones and zeros are getting changed in some organization in America. So it's a very dangerous thing that we have to worry about. We know the Chinese are in everything that's come out recently. When we said it, people said, "Oh, you're anti-Chinese and you're trying to help Trump win the election." Now the Biden administration has come out and said, "Well, the Chinese are in systems and infrastructure systems all over America." They've publicly said this. Now, if there's a war in Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits, we can't assume that it's going to be confined to the Taiwan Straits. With the access that the Chinese have to so many of our infrastructure projects now and infrastructure utilities, if they shut down electrical grids, power systems, telecommunications, you can't call 911 an emergency. You can't dispatch an ambulance. I mean, there are going to be real-world consequences to a cyber attack. So What we haven't figured out is how we don't have a doctrine for cyber yet, the way we do for nuclear weapons. So in the Cold War, it was mutual assured destruction. We had so many nukes pointed at the Russians, and they had so many nukes pointed at us, that if one side launched, and the other side would destroy the country that launched. So you had this deterrence theory. In cyber, there's no real deterrence theory yet. We haven't come up with a doctrine. Now, I can tell you, without getting into details, the United States of America has exquisite capabilities in this front, and our adversaries should be on guard. I said this publicly before. China and Russia and Iran shouldn't think that they can get away with cyber attacks on the United States without a response that will be devastating to them. But again, I think all these countries are trying to feel their way through. But the Russians and Chinese have gotten, especially over the past several years, very brazen about their attacks on us, even if they're probing attacks, even if they're testing attacks. And we can expect in the next great power war or serious crisis that cyber will be part of that equation, and we've got to be ready to go. We need to develop the doctrine, develop the tools.
It's funny, in former life, I was in charge of the IT of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and thus also of cybersecurity. And we were being attacked every day. Every day. Usually, the open attacks were the students from Siberia, and the Russian ambassador would emphasize again and again and again that we are a free country, we don't control all the students. And then anyway, so we had attacks all the time, and it's interesting to see how the attacks are designed. The Russians go in openly, they try and test your defenses. The Chinese go in, explore the system, and wait. So, and quite often you don't see that they've been there. The North Koreans go in for money, so basically it's extortion operations, it's financing the state, and the Iranians have a special focus on Israel, and so they go mainly on Israel, but there have been a few examples where they've been active elsewhere. What Ambassador O'Brien was saying is of the utmost importance. We need an international legislation on the laws of war adapted to the war of the 21st century. Because the reality is that we could be at war without knowing it. We could be in a war that's going to kill people, and we don't even know, or legally speaking, we don't know whether. And as a Swiss, and Switzerland has been the guardian of the Graal, the keeper of the Graal of international legislation and of the laws of war. We are, at the same time, losing the ability to negotiate traditional arms control agreements because we have left most of the arms control agreements of the 20th century lapse without keeping the knowledge, and we were discussing it at the table just before, we are losing the ability to negotiate arms control agreements, and in the new dimension of war, we have no idea how we are going to deal with it. And this will be a very important task because sometimes you need them, lawyers. You will need international lawyers to think about the redefinition of the laws of war in the 21st century, because cyber is part of it, and cyber is not just switching off the lights. Cyber kills. Cyber kills. And so this is one of the dimensions that we'll have to work on very, very, very intensely in the next 3 years.
Let me just jump in there. If you think about the Internet of Things, think about your car. How many sensors and chips are in your car? If your car gets hacked and it gets taken over, you could be driven somewhere, you could be driven off a cliff. Think about your dishwasher, your refrigerator. Everything that's connected to the internet is subject to attack, in either a broad attack or an individualized attack. And one of the things we're concerned about, we're helping a company think through this, a medical device company. It's going to have a sensor implanted in a body that's going to have, it's a miracle device. It's going to help a lot of people and save a lot of lives. But that sensor is capable of getting hacked because it works on a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth basis and communicates with the phone to give the physicians the information they need and to regulate the instrument. But they're actually worried about Chinese hackers hacking into that and killing people with it, having this instrument go haywire. So when you think about how deadly this all is, this is very serious stuff that affects civilians. This is just talking about military platforms and trying to bring down an F-35 because you can get access to a chip or bring down a missile. This could be tailored to individuals with your car, with your medical devices, with your home appliances. You need to have your refrigerator come after you, but potentially that could happen. So this is beyond theoretical now. This is real world, and it's scary. We need to stay ahead of it. Make sure that that's one thing when we talk about innovation. We need to make sure we're not as big as the Chinese, but America and its like-minded partners, the Swiss, the Australians, the Brits, the European Union, Japanese, all the like-minded countries. We can out-innovate the Chinese. We may not be able to outwork them, but we can out-innovate them. And that's why we need to make sure that the laws, and Isabel and I were talking about this, why Swiss laws are so good and American laws are so good, at least for now, and why European laws are getting very dangerous, because we're so over-regulating our tech leaders. We're stifling the very innovation that we need to win the tech war and make sure that we can stay ahead of the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians when it comes to cyber and some of the things that Jacques talked about.
Any other areas of technology that we should be thinking about, that the public really should understand its role?
Well, what I'm going to say now is mostly about the intention of the Europeans in the room. I do not think that many people in Europe have taken the measure of the industrial and technological revolution that's taking place in the US right now. And I do not think that many people have realized that the train is about to leave the station. And if I look at all the key technologies that are going to make or break the 21st century, the US is leading or co-leading each and every one of these technologies. And we can go from AI to quantum to fusion to 3D printing to mRNA vaccines and so on and so on. The train is about to leave the stations. A few countries have got the message, and thank God so far Switzerland is one of these countries. So we've been intensifying the technological and scientific cooperation like never before. And it's fundamental to do that. It's fundamental to do that because otherwise we will be left behind in a revolution that will make the industrial revolution of the 19th century look like a picnic. So it's really fundamental to understand that. And what Robert was saying about, the day the US goes into a cyber war, and you have the whole power of Silicon Valley behind the cyber war, God have pity on the poor Russian and Chinese hackers, because now it's easy. They are operating freely because no one is really opposing them, because they are at war, but we are not. The moment the US lets loose, it's going to be an interesting day of reckoning for hackers all over the world. But that said, for us, right now, we watch and the developments of all these new technologies. And by the way, Switzerland has been creating a very interesting organization called GESDA, and it's based in Geneva, and it is trying to get all the best brains worldwide to look at the new technologies, look at the challenges, but also at the opportunities that these new technologies offer. If we manage to harness together these new technologies into something positive, the 21st century would be amazing. If they fall into the wrong hands, it's going to be less funny.
So I promise that we're going to open up for questions, and so be ready to raise your hand, and I will call on you shortly. I just have one more question for each of you, and it's more in the geopolitical space. Robert, Neil Ferguson at the Hoover Institution has come to describing the era that we're currently in as Cold War II, believing that and describing this Cold War as actually being a lot more complex and difficult than Cold War I, given the deep relationships that the United States has with China. What is that hyperbolic, or what's your sense of whether we are in fact in Cold War II with China?
Well, Ferguson's a very smart guy. I know him. I want to be careful about arguing with him. I wouldn't say that we're in a Cold War II. That was a very unique situation where the world was really bipolar. You had the Russians, the Soviet Union, and you had America. There was kind of a choice between the two. Granted, they had the group of 72 countries, the NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement. but really it was the U.S. versus Russia. And now we're in a more of a multipolar world. We've got a number of centers of gravity in the world. You've got the United States, you've got Europe, Western Europe, you've got India, you've got Japan, you've got China, of course, you've got Iran trying to become a hegemon in the Middle East. So and not all these poles are equal, and I think America is still the most indispensable power. But we've got an adversary in China that we've never had as Americans before. The Russians did not have an economy anywhere near what the Chinese have. And the Chinese have an economy almost as big as the United States. And it's almost it's almost insurmountable to defeat them because they operate across every sector, every domain. They're relentless. I mean, they're buying our farmland. They're putting cell phone towers up. They're building the biggest navy in the world. They're undermining us with TikTok. They're involved in political warfare. They're involved in rebuilding the military that, is going to be very difficult to defeat in a conventional war. They're building a nuclear arsenal that's going to be as big as the Russians and American nuclear arsenal, and they refuse to get involved in the arms control talks that Jacques mentioned. The Chinese won't have arms control talks because they figure they'll outbuild us, and we're the ones that need it, and not them. So it's a tremendous adversary, but we've got this multipolar world. The way we stand up and talking to my fellow national security advisors around the world, the way we stand up to them is by getting the cool kids together at the lunch table. If you think about it, if you had a choice for your economy, for the your way of life, for your military, would you rather be with Japan, the U.S., Australia, UK, NATO, Western Europe, hopefully India, or would you rather be with the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese? And so as long as we stick together and do the things that Jacques talked about, and make sure that we're really emphasizing technology. I mean, I had a list of things that we had to stay on top of when I was National Security Advisor. My list of priorities. We've got to be number one on hypersonics. We've got to be number one in quantum. We've got to be number one in AI. We've got to be number one in machine learning. We need to be number one in autonomous vehicles, in whether that's undersea, or in air, or on land. There are so many things that we need to do, but we can't, as America, we can't do it alone. Now we want to bring manufacturing back to America. We want to, but we need to have our trusted partners, and together we can take on the Chinese. Together we can win. But I don't think it's a Cold War the way we had it, where it's the U.S. versus Russia. I think it's more of a multipolar situation. It's more complex, and part of that makes it more dangerous, right? Because with the Russians, we could come to an accord. We could fight proxy wars. We kind of knew what the score was, and it could be ratcheted down. When you have China attacking India, and killing their patrols in the Himalayas, that potentially pulls us into a war that we can't, immediately tamp down. That we can't just call Beijing, because we don't have a hotline to Beijing the way we did with the Russians. So it's a much more complicated world. It's more like chess than checkers, which is I'd say the Cold War. So I agree with Ferguson. We're in a very dangerous situation. The Chinese are a terrific adversary, and we need to view them for what it is, but I think it's a more complicated situation than the Cold War too.
Ambassador, I want to turn our attention to Europe. It's rather remarkable that you are headed to represent this great nation in NATO at a time when so much of what's happening on the continent is in doubt. I was coming through Heathrow on the way here yesterday, and I happened to pick up a copy of the Daily Mail, and I understand that it's a rather tabloid newspaper, but the front screaming headline on the front page was "Europe on the brink." And so with the assassination attempt on the Slovenian president. So talk a little bit about how you're perceiving the role of NATO as you step into this important role, given what's happening, obviously, in Ukraine and Russia and some of these other areas.
I'm going to jump in because Jacques' number one goal is to get Switzerland into NATO. Sweden and Finland were neutral powers for many, many years. It's time for Switzerland to join NATO.
We may have some news to break here.
So Jacques, that's your top goal, I'm sure. That's your American friend. That's why I hope you'll drag Switzerland into NATO.
Now I'm in a very difficult situation. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. But that's another question. But just coming back to the link, of are we in a Cold War or not? And Neil Ferguson, who is a very good friend of mine too, and I admire profoundly. In the end, it is a war. It is a war, and it is a war between totalitarianism, the totalitarian models, and the liberal democracies. And in terms of delivering health, delivering education, delivering security, delivering peace, I mean, it's not even the beginning of a competition. We've been so much better than them for decades now, demonstrating that democracy and liberal democracy is the model that delivers the best results. But the problem is, and that's the difference with the Cold War, we are losing the battle for the narrative. We are losing the battle for the narrative because we have left, on one hand, these countries sell all over the world, including in parts of continents that were going in the right direction, were going democratic, and now they are being convinced again more and more that, and maybe some of the leaders are very happy to be convinced that it will make that we are better off with an authoritarian regime, and it's so much more efficient than the democratic system. So we are losing this particular battle. Back in the Cold War, we were winning it. I remember how much we were fighting Soviet propaganda and trying to show that, of course, democracies are imperfect, and there was the Vietnam War, and there were all the things that we did wrong, and the injustices we committed, and the dictators we supported in countries, because they were our bastards and not their bastards. We all remember that time. But in the end, we were delivering. And now you look at the image that we are projecting after educating generations and generations to think that our own systems are a den of darkness, that we are the most horrible countries on earth, that we have created a world that's so unjust and so and we are actually losing to a narrative that we should not be losing to. So the key question to win this new cold confrontation with systems is to restore faith, and is to restore faith in the superiority of a system which factually has always delivered so much better results than anything else. In spite of warts and all, democracies are not perfect, not even Switzerland. No, Switzerland is perfect. No, Switzerland is perfect. No, not even Switzerland.
Let's open it up for questions. We've got about 10, 15 minutes. Yes?
Yes, Jacques, I think you're too pessimistic. Who's dreaming to go to Russia or to go to China today? Is your daughter dreaming to live there? I think we are not losing anything. And after your 5 years in China, my question is, and you're related to your next job, do you think the tendency to, the attitude towards Europe is different in the democratic side or in the Republican side? Do you think there is a trend to isolationism in the two parties in the country? What is your feeling on that?
I think one is more condescending and the other one is more transactional. The condescending one is, we are still the only ones who can deliver, speaking the United States, which is definitely true. At least in military terms right now, Europe, if you make the exception of Finland and Poland, Europe is a military void. Okay, so that's the reality. So only the Americans can deliver. So one side, but I'm not going to say which side is which, but one side is more on the, you should accept also our societal values and everything, because we are the only ones able to protect you. And the other side is more transactional and going, pay your 2% and we'll discuss with you. But I'm not saying which one is which.
Another question.
Pay your club dues if you want a tea time.
Yes, in the back.
So thank you, first of all. When they told me this evening it was with two ambassadors, I thought it would be very boring indeed. You are a brave man, so you've said some very interesting things, and you put your finger on some of the major issues that really threaten the West, which is the theme of the evening. Why is the West under threat, and what can we do? So my question to you to me, the major threat that's really fundamental and that's occurring underneath many of the things that we're talking about, including the Israel protests, for example, is demographic change, which is a euphemism. Demographic change is going at full blast in Europe and in the United States. Birth rates are at their lowest ever in the United States, as of 2 months ago, I believe, was announced. And I happen to notice on my tramways and my trains in Switzerland that not everyone is of European origin, right? So things are happening very fast. This is not a politically correct subject, but maybe you'll have the courage to comment on the subject.
Well, look, Mark Stein used to call Europe Eurabia. There's been massive immigration to Europe with people that don't share our values. And I'm all for immigration. I think it's a wonderful thing. My wife is an immigrant into America. So I'm a lucky guy to have her having come from South Africa to America. But I think there are a couple of things. I think the people that come to America should want to be Americans and should be appreciative of our Republican style of government with a little r, not a big R, and our freedoms and our values. Doesn't mean you can't have different opinions. That's what makes us great. But you should be in accord with. You shouldn't want to come to America and shout "Death to America" and burn the American flag, and promote Al Qaeda or Hamas. I mean that's not right. So the other thing is people ought to sign the guest book on their way into the country. I mean, we ought to know who's there. We've had in the past year, I think, the biggest national security threat to our country that we've seen in years. And that's 30,000 military-aged Chinese males who come into America. We can't track them. Some of them we've caught. They've been at shooting ranges already. They've been tried to infiltrate military bases already. But China knows every person who leaves the country. You can't just book a flight to America from China. These aren't democracy protesters from Hong Kong that escaped. You know, what are they? Why did they all of a sudden show up since the border's been open and show up in the last year in such big numbers? So it's something to be very concerned about. So I think there are concerns about the demography, but what I'm not concerned about is the people who want to be in America, and I'm sure it's the same for people who want to be in Europe because they share our values. I mean, we've been very lucky. You know, it's been attributed to Bismarck. They said it's his foreign secretary who said it, or his foreign minister. But God bless his drunk fools in the United States of America. And we've had such great immigrants. I mean, we've been blessed with most of our immigrants from our southern border, which has been open, are Catholic. They're Hispanic. They're Mexican. They share a lot of our same values. And now, even on the political front, they're becoming more Republican. And so, you know, you see Donald Trump, because he's got a populist message, picking up massive support among black males, among Hispanics. So I don't think the demography means that you can't win because people who are different, look different than you, are coming into America. If we've got good education and people share our values, understand the benefits that they get from good government, on my side, the GOP side, I think that's great. But I think we have to be very concerned about people that either are openly antagonistic to us, jihadists who want to destroy our way of life, or if they're being sent over by the communist Chinese to infiltrate our country in the event of a war, to be a fifth column. I think we got to be very concerned about that. I think Europe's had some of the same issues with some of its immigration has been uncontrolled. So, you know, the good news for us is, and you made the point. I'm sorry, you were the Reuters, the Le Figaro reporter. No one is going to LAX, the airport I fly out of most, or no one's going to Geneva Airport and climbing into the wheel well of a 747 or climbing on the wing of an airplane trying to get out of Switzerland or trying to get out of America. But a lot of people are trying to get out of other countries to come to our countries. And I think that is a sign of hope. And I think it says that we're doing something right in this contest of ideas, even though it is a little rough these days, as Jacques pointed out.
I love demography. It's one of the very few sciences that never lie. Because you know exactly today how many 50-years-old males will be in the country in 50 years from now, because that's the year when they're born. And so the demographic predictions, if they are not done by the Club of Rome, are usually fairly accurate. So if you look at what's coming, the demographic revolution coming our way is probably one of the biggest earthquakes that we will have experienced, or that humankind will have experienced, meaning the shrinking of the human population, because we are heading globally towards a massive shrinking of the human population, but in a very unbalanced way. According to projections, China should have 600 million people by the end of the 22nd century, 600 million. Japan will more or less have disappeared from the face of the earth. Right now, the country with the lowest birth rate in the world is South Korea. Latin America has reached the point where it's below the replacement level. So it's not a matter of the world population increasing massively. It's about a massive decrease that will pose, especially in the transition phase from a very high population to there will be lots of old people to take care of. Now this is compounded by the fact that some regions in the world do not have yet reached this point, though even in sub-Saharan Africa, you see now certain countries, the highest with the higher level of Human Development Index, actually seeing their birth rate sink. So it's already happening faster than we think. Now, there is a fundamental difference between America and Europe. The very business model of America was immigration. That's the business model of the country. And it's amazing to see how, from the beginning, every time there was a new wave of immigrants, oh my God, all these Irish, they're Catholics, they're not Protestants like us, they will destroy America. Then came these ones, then came the next one, then came the next one. And every time you had the same knee-jerk reaction, because it's normal, because you have new people coming with new habits. But a generation later, they were all Americans. And it still works. And I'm looking at one of very interesting factors is to look at the African, sub-Saharan African immigration in the US. Their success rate socially and at university is comparable to the ones of the Koreans. They are living the American dream. The American dream is valid. They might be disadvantaged maybe in police controls because of the color of the skin, but in society they are extremely successful. Europe, were traditionally is a continent of immigration. So we are learning to deal with massive immigration, and not very successfully so far. Because what the Americans do is they set a certain number of conditions. That's what you have to abide by to be American, and then you can eat what you want, and you can do what you want to listen to, the music you want to listen to, but these are the conditions you have to abide to be American, and it works. Here we have always oscillated between tolerance for anything, including intolerance, tolerating people who, in the name of their culture, can do things that we could never do legally in our own country. So this is something that's totally different. We have to learn. We have to learn from the US model, because if you look at demography and the demographic revolution I was mentioning coming our way, Europe will be an immigration continent for the next century. So either we learn to deal with it or we'll be destroyed by it. It's fairly simple.
We have time for one more question.
More on the academic side was the first question that you posed up. I would like your comment on the influence of the media, because as an academic, if any of my students were to publish what some of the media or social media publish, they would never even get past the first screening. And so how come, in your perspective, we as governments allow a lot of trash, let's say, to be put into the media, social media, and that we absorb it? Is there anything that you think that we should or could do about it?
So in America, the central tenet of our democracy is free speech. And we have an amendment, the First Amendment to our Constitution protects speech, religion, right to assemble, petition the government for the redress of grievances. So anytime the government, I'm very skeptical of anytime the government wants to label something as disinformation or misinformation and censor it. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. And we've seen that happen in the last two elections, where certain elements of the U.S. government have combined with social media companies to either downplay stories or to censor them outright. Now, having said that, we've got to be concerned about deep fakes and AI and truly, bogus scams. So one of the things, you'd hate to have a presidential candidate deep faked and spoofed and come on TV 2 days before the election and say he was dropping out of the race or something of that nature. So there's a balance. There's a fine line between stopping true misinformation and labeling speech that you don't like as misinformation or as dangerous. And so it's something we have to be very careful about. I don't think anyone knows how to do that yet. But the one thing we do need to be careful about are these deep fakes and the computer AI assisted generated video and voice calls and video of people doing things. That's pretty scary.
In 2008, I was head of security policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we organized a huge international exercise. We were planning for all the possible terrorist scenarios. And this one, we had 27 nations, we had the CDC, and our topic was a respiratory disease that would paralyze the world and bring the world to a stop. And the only difference with what happened with COVID was that it was man-made, and it had been set off by different terrorists all over the world too, but that was the only difference. We had it all. We had it all. We had everything from the interruption of the logistic chains to the schools being closed to the absence of protective equipment. There was one thing we had not seen. It was that every dumbhead on the internet would be a scientist. And that instead of having the science speak in a certain way authoritatively and just sending a message. Of course, science is never perfectly right, but at some point, you have to trust the scientists to do the right thing. And certainly, we were totally overwhelmed by a number of health specialists who the week before had been specialists for security policy and the week before specialists for ornithology, but certainly they were specialists for infectious diseases and immunology, and there was nothing we could do to control it. The state could do nothing to control them. And the most extreme case I saw was a fake study by a French doctor with so many titles. He had been studying at so many universities and in fact, turns out the doctor never existed. And he had demonstrated that there was a plot between a French pharmaceutical company and the Chinese to create a virus, but they already had the vaccine, and it was to fleece us all and whatever. And of course, the thing finished with a long edited list of the shareholders of the said company, and all the names were Jewish. Meaning we were back to the 15th century where we would burn the Jews for having created the Black Death by sacrificing children in there. And that was on the internet, and you had very serious people here sharing this study by this French scientist and saying, interesting, we don't believe it, but it's interesting, it's another opinion, and there was no one out there to check the simplest thing, which I did, which was, does this scientist exist? And he didn't.
Please join me in thanking our two ambassadors for tonight's conversation. One of the things that has been such an inspiration to me, getting to know you, Robert, and getting to know you, Jacques, more recently, and it's certainly exemplified in our former ambassadors who are joining us here tonight, is the importance of public service. And I think if there was to be a single answer as to how are we going to confront the challenges facing the West, it's going to be if we can continue to prepare people like you to do the things that you do. You could be doing millions of other things.
You got a bunch of them here, Sydney and others.
I know we do. I know we do. And that's the thing that, again, if there's one thing that gets me up in the morning as the dean of a policy school is I know that we're preparing that next generation. I know a place like Pepperdine University, which is committed to preparing truth seekers. And that really was what struck me about this last piece, is that the great value of the West is the pursuit of truth in all its dimensions. And that requires two things, really. It requires a desire to want to know the truth. And then it requires a skill set and perspective that is willing to learn and seek truth, to think critically from all these different perspectives. And so this aspect, I think, of this evening is what is going to be my big takeaway, is that we are living in a very polarized time. I returned to a country on Monday that is extremely polarized in an election year. To see what's happening here in Europe certainly is cause for concern, as we've talked about. But we cannot lose hope. And I think that is another dimension, I believe, of what Pepperdine uniquely brings to the world, is we bring a commitment to seek the truth, but also to do so in hope, because we have a hope that does not disappoint. And so I want to thank everyone here for joining us here. If this is your first time at Pepperdine, please know that you are always welcome here. One of the reasons I was so excited about bringing these two gentlemen here for tonight's conversation is I knew that they were going to invite some very interesting people to join us. And we are not even done with our first year of operation here at the Chateau, right? We are still in the midst of our first academic year at the Chateau. But I hope what you've sensed this evening is a desire to build relationships. That is the reason why Pepperdine wanted to be based in Switzerland, is that you are a place of global importance, and that importance is based on global relationships. Pepperdine is a university that is committed to building global relationships and to do so in very special places like this chateau. So I invite you again this evening, after we adjourn, in the weeks to come, please get to know Mark Goodman, who runs this facility and is building relationships on behalf of Pepperdine. I certainly welcome any questions that you might have about the School of Public Policy. We are already planning our next conference here. Will be in the fall, probably late September. We'll be on some topic related to national security, so please be aware that we're going to be sending out word about that as well. But I want you to know that we want you to see this place as your home as well. That is why Pepperdine built this place, is we built it to open doors for our students, but also for relationships with people like you. So again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you've had a wonderful experience, but may it not be your last here. Thank you and good night.